Hello, this is Marbozir and welcome back to Civilization 5 Deity, guys. So, in this episode we're going to talk a bit more about pre-game setup in context of Deity difficulty, as always. I already talked about civilizations, although I could talk a lot more about that. However, let's move on to other things. So, there are a few advanced settings that can affect Deity difficulty quite significantly. So, let's talk about the most obvious choice here, which is the map type. And as a general rule, I would strongly recommend against any map template that has a high possibility of starting you isolated. As tempting as it is, because starting isolated means that you don't have to worry about early aggression from the AI, so that can be quite tempting, right? However, starting isolated on Deity is almost always a bad thing. The most obvious reasons aside, like not having trading partners early on, most of the reasons why it's not good to start isolated on Deity have to do with science, because remember that on Deity you start behind the AI by design. You are already 5 technologies behind the AI on turn 0. So if you send a trade route to an AI that's multiple technologies ahead of you, you will get science out of that trade route. The further ahead of you that civilization is, the more science you will get out of every single trade route. So that's a pretty good way to boost your science early on. Send a trade route to your neighbor, get extra science from that. Not only that, if you have a neighbor very close to you, there is a high possibility that this neighbor will send a trade route to your city and give you science like that. You can even double your science output early on through trade routes. The science bonus from trade routes when sending them to civilizations ahead of you is quite significant. But there's also one more reason why starting isolated is not a good thing, and this is a mechanic that's often overlooked from what I noticed. And this is the discount that you get for researching technologies that were already discovered by other civilizations. This discount can reach up to 20 to 23% or so. It depends on things like map size, on the number of civilizations in the game, and a few other things, but in general, the maximum value of this discount is between 20 and 25%. So it's quite significant. However, you only get a discount or lower cost of researching a technology that was already discovered by other AIs if you made contact with these AIs. So that's why making contact with as many AIs as possible early on is extremely important. And starting isolated on your own island, for example. So if you pick Archipelago map, while Archipelago can make the game easier in different ways, because the AI is generally not very competent at naval battles, for example, but if you start on an Archipelago map on your own island, you will be unable to make any contact with any AIs until at least sailing and or optics. So that will delay the bonuses, the discounts that you will get to researching new technologies quite significantly. This is why I would generally recommend maps like Pangea, because on Pangea map you will not have any major problems making contact with most of the AIs in the game, unless you get extremely unlucky and start in an isolated location, but that happens very rarely on Pangea maps. If you do start in an isolated location, or if you pick a map like Archipelago and then start on your own island with no one else on it, I would generally recommend rushing sailing research as soon as possible and getting a trireme out to find other civilizations for the exact reasons that I mentioned. First of all, you want to know if there are any coastal cities in range of your cargo ships to send trade routes to other AIs for that science boost. But more importantly, you want to get that science discount to researching technologies that are already known by the other leaders. And again, you start multiple technologies behind on turn 0. So you can take advantage of the science discount as soon as you find other AIs. There will always be technologies that were already researched by other AIs at the start of the game, since you will always be behind. And speaking of science, that science discount is actually one of the major reasons why games on Deity are generally shorter than games on lower difficulty levels, because you will progress through eras and through technologies faster than on lower difficulty levels, simply because you will be getting that science discount for at least half the game. It will take you a while to catch up to the science leader, and you will be able to take advantage of that discount pretty much constantly or almost constantly for the first half of the game. So I sometimes see people asking, how are you able to research this or that technology or get to this or that era before turn 100, 200, 250 or whatever? This is one of the big reasons why. It's not the only reason, because you do have to optimize your science quite a lot on Deity difficulty, otherwise you will not be able to catch up to the AI to begin with. But it definitely helps. Anyway, since we're already talking about how fast or how slow the game is, let's talk about the game pace a bit. Now, most people usually play the game on standard, and there's one thing to keep in mind here. The regular game on standard is capped at 500 turns. But while you might see turn 400, 450 or whatever on lower difficulty levels while playing on standard, the game will generally not take longer than 350 or even 300 turns on Deity. That's simply because if you don't win the game before turn 300, 350, or at least if you don't secure a victory, the AI will win the game. You need to either win the game before turn 300, 350, or you need to secure a victory, in the sense that you need to reduce the AIs to the point of being irrelevant or being unable to win the game. So either through conquest, or you need to be so far ahead of the AIs at that point that they will not be able to win the game before you do. If you want the game to take longer than 300, 350 turns, I would actually strongly recommend giving Epic Game Pace a try. Because on Epic Game Pace, an average game on Deity will usually take between 450 and 500 turns, which is still less than the maximum game length on standard game speed. On standard game speed, the game is capped at 500 turns. On Epic, it's 750. But you will not get even remotely close to turn 750. The game will be over before turn 500 90% of the time, either because you will win or the AI will win. So if you're looking for a game between 400 and 500 turns, I would recommend Epic Game Pace. If you are okay with game being over between turn 300 and 350, then stick with standard game pace. I personally find 300 turns to be a little bit short, but it's just something that you need to know in advance. A standard game speed game on Deity will never get even remotely close to turn 500, while it might on lower difficulty levels. On Deity, it definitely won't. So, few more things. Let's talk about some other advanced options. Now, if you want to make your first Deity games a little bit easier than they normally would be, you can turn off specific victory types. Now, on Deity, the most likely victory type the AI is going to get is Science. That's the number one victory type the AI will usually win through if the AI beats you. So you could turn off Science victory to not have to worry about that. The second clause is Culture victory, but it's much easier to prevent Culture victory than it is to prevent a Science victory. You can't really prevent a Science victory, other than by completely wiping out that AI. Even if you take their capital, that will not prevent a Science victory, because the capital city will just get relocated to another city, the AI will save all the progress towards the spaceship, and it will just continue building spaceship parts in other cities. The only real way to prevent a Science victory is to either just completely eliminate that AI, wipe them out, or take all of their cities with decent production, and leave them with some tiny cities that have so low production that building a spaceship part there would take 100 turns. Having said that, you don't have to turn off Science victory, but there's nothing wrong with doing it, especially if you're only getting started on Deity. If you never played Deity games before, there's absolutely nothing wrong with turning it off. So let's go back to map choice for a moment before we talk about some of the other advanced options here. One of the map templates that I would specifically suggest avoiding is continents, because on continents map you can often run into a situation where you start on one continent yourself and the other continent gets completely dominated by one of the AIs. And by the time you can reach them, there's one AI in almost complete control of that continent and snowballing massively to win the game. It can be a pretty tough situation to deal with, and you will often not be able to do anything about that, since you will just not be able to reach that continent in time. Having said that, it's not impossible to deal with that kind of situation, it's just something that's not easy to deal with. So I would definitely suggest avoiding continents template. So there are a few more advanced options that can affect the game in a less obvious way, and specifically these two options at the bottom of the list: Raging Barbarians and the random personalities. I know Raging Barbarians is an option that a lot of people generally avoid. However, Raging Barbarians can sometimes make the game a little bit easier on Deity, as long as you are able to deal with Barbarians yourself, because the AI is not always very good at dealing with Raging Barbarians. Barbarians can often steal AI's workers or even settlers, slowing down AI's expansion significantly. So it's something to consider. Random personalities is another interesting option. Random personalities can make the game less predictable, because once you know the general personality of every single leader and flavors that affect every single leader, you will generally know what to expect from that specific AI. Random personalities randomizes all of that. However, random personalities can also make the game a little bit easier, because the way flavors are often set up is to make the AI take advantage of its unique units and unique abilities better. So if you randomize that, it can often lead to a situation where you have a specific civilization and AI is just not really playing to that civilization's strengths, because the randomized personality made it pretty much avoid all the main strengths of that AI. So while it can make the game less predictable and perhaps more interesting because you don't know what to expect from specific civilizations, it can make it easier, which is what you might want to do. So I would actually consider this option. Another option that might be worth considering in advanced game options is no ancient ruins. Now I usually don't use this, but it's worth considering because while this obviously means you won't be able to get any early game boosts through ruins, it also means that the AI won't be able to get any boosts either. And since ruins can give you free technologies, and AI already starts significantly ahead of you at the start of the game, you might want to avoid a situation where the AI can randomly get even more technologies at the start of the game. So this is one option that might be worth considering. So there's one more option that I wanted to talk about before getting into the actual game, and that's the resources setting. It's set to standard by default, but it has a few interesting options, including abundant, which generally means there is going to be more of everything on the map. So strategic resources will have more resources in them, there will be more luxuries on the map. So it's fairly self-explanatory. There's the legendary start option, which means you will have more resources, more luxuries and copies of a luxury next to your capital city. However, this also gives the AI a stronger start. So I would actually suggest avoiding this option on Deity, because yeah, it's quite tempting to get a strong start through legendary start, but this will also give the AI a very strong start. And this increases the risk of one of the AIs snowballing massively out of control. If one of the AIs gets, let's say, multiple copies of salt right next to their capital, they will get an extremely strong start, and that will definitely increase the risk of that AI dominating all the other AIs in its region. So I would suggest avoiding this option on Deity. There's the strategic balance option, which is definitely worth considering. This gives you more strategic resources close to your capital city or in your general starting area. This mostly applies to horses, iron and oil. If you're playing a civilization that actually needs iron or horses for their unique units, for example, and you plan to actually take advantage of these units, I would definitely recommend using strategic balance, or at least considering using strategic balance, unless you want to risk the situation where you will not have any iron anywhere close to your starting area. Unless you are okay with that kind of situation and enjoy dealing with it, then obviously there's no problem. But be aware that starting with standard setting might lead to a situation where you don't have iron or horses or any other specific strategic resource anywhere close to your starting area. So out of all these advanced options in resources, the strategic balance is probably the only one I would consider, because as a general rule, the AI can take advantage of the strong capital city start way better than you on Deity, especially if it gets multiple copies of salt. So this covers all the advanced options and pre-game options that I wanted to discuss. There is still the map size, and as a general rule, I would suggest avoiding huge maps and maybe even large maps. Not only because it makes your game slower, because the turn length in the late game can be pretty slow, but the main reason why I would suggest avoiding huge maps is because on Deity, the AI can expand as much as it likes. It doesn't really have to worry about things like happiness, and some of the civilizations love expanding, and some of the civilizations can go very wide very efficiently, like Rome, for example. Rome AI is one of the more dangerous AIs on Deity, because the AI can take advantage of the Roman unique ability very well, which reduces the costs of buildings that are also built in their capital. So if you give them a lot of space to expand, and if they manage to dominate all the other AIs in their region, they can get very scary and very tough to deal with on huge maps. I would suggest avoiding huge maps. Not to mention, the turn length in the late game on huge maps can be really damn slow, mostly because on Deity, the AI will have huge carpets of units, just massive numbers of units, and the turn can take a while in that kind of scenario. So, let's actually get into the game and discuss the starting location a little bit, and turn 0. So, I know there are two camps here, people who will always settle on spot, no matter what, and people who will consider moving if there are better options nearby. I don't necessarily think there's anything wrong with either of these approaches, but this is more about deciding whether to actually play this start or not. Especially if you're only just starting to play on Deity, there's absolutely nothing wrong with restarting the game. If you see a starting location that's obviously not very good, you can just restart the game and possibly get a better starting location. There's nothing wrong with doing that, absolutely nothing wrong. It's generally always possible to win. There isn't any start that would prevent you from being able to win the game on Deity, but the game can be significantly harder based on a few factors. Let's restart one more time here. Now, one of the biggest factors that I would consider aren't actually luxuries. You will generally always get luxuries in range of your capital. If you don't, then yeah, I suppose that can be a reason to restart sometimes. However, one of the biggest factors that I would consider when deciding whether to keep this start or not is production. Because having a capital city with very low production potential will make the early game significantly slower or harder, and will increase the risk of you falling behind significantly. Okay, so after a few rerolls, here's one situation where I would maybe consider moving my settler, and this is because if we move up here, we would be able to get a coastal city with a river. And having a coastal city, a coastal capital city can be quite important, because that will allow you to get siege trade routes from your capital city. And the siege trade routes, as you probably know, are worth way more than land trade routes. So that's one of the situations where I would consider either moving a settler or maybe rerolling. There are generally a few factors I look at when evaluating a starting location, so potential production is one of them. This city would have reasonable production potential. Not amazing, but we do have silver on a hill tile. We have 3 different hill tiles in range, which isn't amazing, but we also have stone. We have silver on a grassland tile, the stone is also on a grassland tile. So this is not the most amazing production start I've ever seen, but it's not terrible. The worst possible scenario is when you don't have a single hill in range, when you don't have a single tile with decent production in range, where you just don't have any production tiles in range of your capital at all. I would strongly suggest rerolling that kind of game. Again, it's not impossible to win with that kind of start, but it's very slow, it's significantly harder to not fall behind, it's harder to expand, it's harder and slower to build things, it just slows everything down if you don't have decent production potential in your capital. But there are a few other things that I also look at. So one of the biggest is whether you have a river or not. Having a river can be quite important, because that unlocks buildings such as the water mill or a garden. The garden can be very important for great person generation rate. It also allows you to build hydro plants, and while this is a late game consideration, it's definitely worth thinking about that. If you have a lot of tiles with a river with fresh water next to your capital, it will be an amazing location for a hydro plant later on. This city would have, what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 tiles that would benefit from a hydro plant in the future, so that's not too bad. But if this river was even longer, let's say it started down here, then I would have even more tiles that would benefit from the hydro plant in the future. It's something I usually consider. Also, having a river means that this city will generate 25% more gold from land trade routes. That's also something to consider. And another thing that's also worth looking at is whether you have a mountain somewhere nearby. Because if you start a city next to a mountain, you will be able to build an observatory in that city. And having a capital city with an observatory can be huge. Because an observatory gives you a 50% science bonus in that city. So if you stack an observatory with National College, that's going to be massive, especially if you get some academies near that city. Since science yields from academies or from any kind of terrain are affected by the city science modifier. So if your city gets 200% science, the academy will be worth not 8 science but 16. Anyway, there's one more consideration, and that's what kind of tile you will be starting the city on. If you start a city on a flat tile like a grassland or plains, that city will only have 1 hammer. If you move to a hill tile, not only the city will get a combat bonus, which isn't that big, but it can be important if you get attacked early on. But if you start a city on a hill, you will get 2 hammers instead. That's just 1 hammer difference, but that 1 hammer will be a significant percentage of your city's total production at the start of the game. So it can be important and it will speed things up. Right now, if I look a tile with food and get started on a scout, that scout will be finished in 5 turns. So it's something to consider. If you can, I would generally suggest starting cities on hills. I wouldn't necessarily move just to start a city on a hill like I did right here, but if you can move into a location that would be objectively better than the tile you started from, in different ways, not just because it's a hill, but if you can get a better location while getting a hill when you otherwise wouldn't, it's generally worth losing that 1 turn, since you can't move into a hill and then start a city on the same turn, you have to wait. It's worth losing 1 turn to get a superior location. So here's one example of a very good start. We have a location that has a wheat tile, which is generally very good because it will give you a high food yield early on and gets even higher food if you build a granary. But we also have decent production potential, we have multiple hills in range, we also have a hill with gold. Any hill tile with a special resource is generally worth quite a lot. But we also have a city location right next to a mountain, so that's an observatory, and we have a river. We have a lot of river tiles nearby, which means a hydro plant in the city will be quite good later on. We could move to get a coastal city and give up a mountain, but I would prioritize mountain start above anything else. So if I were to make a priority list and put, let's say, a mountain start, a river start, a coastal start, and prioritize them, I would prioritize a mountain start over everything else. I would even consider giving up a river to get a mountain start. So if you can get a mountain, but get a city without a river, let's say I would have to move to get a mountain start, but I would be giving up a river. It's worth giving that up to get a mountain start, because that science bonus is just so good in the long run. So that covers everything I wanted to discuss in this episode. I hope you found at least some of it useful, and as always, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.